This little neighborhood of Brandywine, Maryland, is as sweet as it sounds.
Brandywine is probably maybe 20 miles or maybe 30 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. Lots of land, lots of homes, single-family homes spaced out.
There's no street more serene than Charm Court.
Charm Court was a very quiet neighborhood. All the neighbors seemed to care about one another.
It's the perfect place for Ronald Ragland.
Ronald Ragland was an average working class man.
Ronald is a driver for a national trucking company. He and his wife, Judy, have been here longer than anyone else.
Thanks a lot, sweetie.
He was one of the first residents of the Brandywine.
This home was literally his castle.
The table is quite extensive, as you can see from my place. It's the most beautiful place on the block.
His neighbors, Leroy and Bonnie Davis, know how much his home means to him.
He took pride in his home and was a very, prideful man.
We'll get this deck built, and it'll be almost as good as mine.
Oh, sure.
Almost.
Don't pay him any mind.
He even said that everybody else's property's value has gone up because of his property.
So when are the kids coming? Oh, the kids, I can't wait. Christmas.
Ronald may always have a smile on his face, but there's sadness hiding behind it.
His son tragically died in a car accident.
I believe it involved a drunk driver. That's a parent's worst nightmare, to lose a child.
Since then, the street has been quiet. Too quiet. But all of that is about to change. Someone just bought the house across the way.
Oh, look, they have kids.
Robert and Donna Mitchell think this is the ideal neighborhood to raise their twin boys, Roderick and Rob Jr.
They were a working class family, hard-working family.
I got the front bedroom. No, it's mine.
The Mitchell family was a very warm family. The two sons, they were very friendly.
Boys, nobody goes in empty-handed. What are you two thinking?
Mr. Mitchell, he seemed to be very close to his sons. He loved them tremendously.
All the rooms are great. Okay, so there's no need to race for it, except race for it.
Robert is a proud Army veteran who served with distinction before being injured. Moving to this neighborhood is a dream come true.
He brought us from the hood, I guess you can say. My dad was ecstatic about, providing, being able to be a provider for his family.
I got the sense that that was a step up from them, the humble beginnings that they had come from.
As the self-appointed ambassador of the neighborhood, Ronald is first to greet the newcomers.
Oh, thank you very much.
They hit it off from the start.
I hope you're going to enjoy that. Welcome to the neighborhood, son. Yeah.
But the good times won't last long.
As time moved on, people showed their true colors.
Right now, the friendship is blossoming.
We got to know the neighbors. Neighbors got to know us.
Well, we're doing all right.
Yes, we had a good relationship.
They would go over to one another's homes. They spent a lot of time together.
Let's see if I can show you some old man skills.
The Mitchells regarded the Raglands as dear friends, and I would assume that the Raglands regarded the Mitchells in the same way.
Come set the table.
For Ronald, It's a chance to bond with kids again.
Thank you.
As the Mitchell boys settle in, they make new friends.
Yeah!
Suddenly, Charm Court is full of lively teenagers.
Yeah! See that right?
Hands up!
Like Lakeisha Garner.
Hell no. We can't have them.
Being friends with them, it was just like, you know, felt like I had the best friends / family in the world.
More kids on the street means more noise. And that's a problem for Ronald.
Ronald getting sleep during the day was essential for him to function during the nighttime hours of driving a truck.
Hey! Come on, man, we're just... Get off the lawn now! Come on, man, we're just playing. I don't give a damn what you're doing. Stay on your side of the street. What are you doing?
Keep that ball off my MF grass. You know, like, just he'll cuss at us. Like, just keep that away from here. This and third. Stop running across my grass.
Ron, they're just kids having fun.
My dad just told him, you know, like, they're kids. Like, let them, kids gonna be kids, let them be kids.
Look, man, I work nights. I need my rest. They're making...
Robert Sr. has taught his boys to respect their elders.
Okay, we get it. Son, apologize to the man. Come on, go on.
Sorry, sir. All right, then.
Before long, respect turns into resentment.
My twin brother and I, we were outside skateboarding on a driveway, a vacant home.
What the heck are you serious? You're making noise all night. I'm trying to get you to sleep, and you're just asleep, and you're making blood noise out here.
Mr. Ragland grabbed up Rod by the collar and, was yelling at him and yanking him around.
It's noise all night. I'm trying to get...
Cussing at him, letting him know, hey, this is not your house. You don't need to be using this driveway as your ramp.
Driveway, man. Stop working out here.
This time, the Mitchell boys fight back.
Get off this block. I've had enough of this. Get out of here right now. You're making too much noise.
They felt the need to stand up for themselves.
Hey, Ron, cool it.
And Robert Sr. arrives to stand up for them.
You're weighing by 100 pounds. Stop, never mind.
My dad came out and approached Ronald Ragland as far as to, it's not your son. You don't have anything to say to him.
Hands on me, man. Not put your hands on me because you don't know how this is going on.
Mr. Mitchell actually got, very angry at Mr. Ragland, enough so to, come to blows with him.
That's when things started going downhill.
It really just blew my mind.
You kids making all this wreck out here. I'm trying to get...
Ronald Ragland was pleased when Robert Mitchell moved in across from him with twin sons, Roderick and Rob Jr. But things changed once the kids took over the street.
Why does it matter?
He was the type of person where he was not going to be disrespected. He couldn't let anything go.
Cool it. Cross the street. Cross the street. That's it.
Bonnie Davis is shocked by what she sees when she comes home from work.
My neighborhood. This is my neighborhood. You need to get...
The main concern was to help those guys to not get into a physical fight.
Everybody, you cross the street right now.
That's enough! Stop!
Other neighbors came out and had to separate the two of them.
Cross the street. Cross the street.
Crazy! Get in the house! Get in the house!
Tell me what to do. Hey, listen, what did I tell you two guys? This is a problem, okay? I don't want this anymore.
Daddy told him, look, stay away from Mr. Ragland. Don't have anything to do with Mr. Ragland.
Don't want any problems with this guy.
Didn't even do anything.
Do you hear me?
I think Robert Jr. thought that, I'm going to be respectful of what you said, but I'm going to also stand up for what I believe is right.
Having kids move into the neighborhood isn't a blessing anymore. It's a curse.
What do I have to do around here to get some peace and quiet?
I think Ronald did feel betrayed by both the boys.
These people just make noise. I've had enough.
When they moved in, he opened up his arms for them, and now all this stuff is happening.
Ronald is not going to let the Mitchells destroy the peace and quiet of his beloved Charm Court.
It seemed like Ronald was dead set on that, and he just seemed like he wanted things his way on Charm Court, and it should have been named Ragland Court, not Charm Court.
But some feel there's another reason Ronald is so upset.
I'm sure Mr. Ragland was jealous of the Mitchell family.
He had gone through a lot with losing his son, and that was something that he really was battling.
I think all that started to build up.
Still, that doesn't mean the Mitchell family has to suffer for it.
Like, wow, you have nothing else to do but to try to sabotage a good life that you don't have. You want somebody else to feel your pain.
If Ronald thought a bunch of kids skateboarding on the block was bad, it gets worse now that Rob Jr. and Roderick are high school seniors.
You made it, huh?
They had loud music and quite a few people over.
We all were just having fun, listening to music, dancing.
Not everyone is having fun.
Mr. Ragland was across the street in his driveway, smoking his cigarettes.
Oh, hell no. No.
What are you doing? You can't park this here. Move it. Let's go.
Don't worry about it. Mr. Ragland, seriously, come on.
It's one of those times that he felt like he was the owner of the neighborhood, wanted to, dictate everything that goes on.
Seriously, Mr. Ragland, why do you always have to be such a jerk? Are you even planning to leave tonight?
Watch your mouth. Get out of here.
Leave us alone.
Outnumbered, Ronald calls for backup.
Next thing you know, the police are arriving at the house.
Is there a problem, officer?
There's been a complaint. Who complained? It was him.
Look, we just don't want things. Look, we don't want things to escalate.
Escalate? What's that supposed to mean?
We don't want anybody, to go to jail tonight.
According to, Robert Mitchell, they weren't doing anything wrong. Ragland was just overreacting, and he just did it because he could do it.
Is that really necessary?
We gotta do something. You'll see. Those brats are ruining this neighborhood.
Once they moved in the neighborhood took a decline. I mean, that was his ultimate view of the Mitchells.
Ronald is right about one thing. The neighborhood is starting to change.
There were a few house break-ins down that way.
Residents are shocked when a home on their exclusive street is burglarized in broad daylight. And Ronald is pretty sure he knows who's to blame.
He did suspect that the twins, the Mitchell boys, were responsible for the breaking of a neighbor's house around the corner.
Police came to my house because they said they had a call for a breaking and entering.
Why are you talking to us?
My boys had nothing to do with it, but I better know who called.
Robert was very upset about Mr. Ragland calling the police.
Robert Mitchell Sr. stands by his kids.
Sorry to waste your time.
And since there is nothing linking them to the break-in, the police move on. That doesn't sit well with Ronald.
Man, these ghetto Mitchells have been ruining this damn house. It's all up to me as usual. Yeah, that's right.
See that? What are we gonna do about them? What are we gonna do?
I think Mr. Ragland wanted to turn everybody against the Mitchells in the neighborhood.
That's what we're dealing with around here? What are we gonna do about them?
We have to get these Mitchells out of here because they're bad for the neighborhood.
These people are ruining this neighborhood. What are we gonna do about it? Hey!
I began to feel hatred toward the Mitchell family.
Hey!
This all has got to stop!
Exactly. He's got to stop harassing our kids.
You know what?
The situation takes a toll on the Mitchells as well.
This time, honey. Never mind that.
But he's the one that wrecked
You
everything!
think that's supposed to be the problem?
Who asked you to...
It was frustrating, my dad. It really was.
Dropping his phone.
This is not the life Rob Jr. and Roderick were hoping for when they moved here. And they blame Ronald.
He just made it to the point where they were just enemies. They wanted revenge.
Back away! Mr. Ragland, why do you always have to be such a jerk?
It seems like the feeling had gotten so strong that it was just like a wall was built up, and the relationships were just not going anywhere good.
Ronald Ragland blames the Mitchell family for dragging his neighborhood into chaos.
What are we gonna do about it?
Tonight, it's about to get worse.
At some point, it was bound to happen.
Hey! Yeah, that's right. Run! Run! My neighborhood. I'll get you. Better run. No good.
Ronald's home is vandalized in the middle of the night. Even though he didn't see who did it, he knows who's responsible.
Are you kidding me? My house?
I don't think he had any proof, but I think that anything that happened in that neighborhood, he would put on the Mitchell boys.
Now, he had a personal vendetta against the Mitchells.
Kids! See what they did to the front of my house?
Once that line was crossed, you know, there was no going back for Mr. Ragland.
Once again, Ronald sends police to the Mitchells' front door.
Oh, God. Now what? There's been a complaint about your sons.
We didn't do anything.
You know, as far as his property is concerned, I had nothing to do with, you know?
You heard them. They didn't do anything.
There was a lot of other people in the neighborhood that didn't like this guy.
I'm telling you, we didn't do anything.
Come on, man. I feel like, you know, he got what was coming to him.
Ronald hopes the authorities will take care of his problem. But things don't go that way.
Well, fuck yeah.
There's no proof the Mitchell kids were involved. No arrests are made.
Sorry again for wasting your time. If you're tuning in, that's the late game.
When they left and didn't do, you know, what he wanted them to do, I'm sure it really infuriated him.
Robert is sick of Ronald harassing his sons. And without help from police, Ronald is left to fend for himself.
Mr. Ragland installed a security system throughout the outside of his home.
I think he did it with the sole hope of catching the Mitchell boys in the act. That was definitely his motivation to put those cameras up.
Just the fact that somebody can just sit in front of a TV screen and watch cameras on every angle of the street, I think it was crazy. I honestly was creeped out.
Now Ronald has a complete view of his house, and his neighbor's house too, giving him a ringside seat for the disintegration of the Mitchell marriage.
This attitude I'm moving.
Oh, don't you dare bring that up with me! What about our kids? Did you think about our kids? We were doing just fine where we were. You know what? I'm sick of you, and I'm sick of that. Done.
Once Mr. Ragland learned about the issues that were going on in the Mitchell household, he used that.
What are you looking at? What's the matter? Gotta go back to the ghetto after your family falls apart? You don't know who you're messing with.
Mr. Mitchell was not a violent man. He mentioned about how he used to spar with boxers and everything like that, and how he could really take care of business if he had to.
Mr. Mitchell was in the military. Mr. Mitchell will always tell us there's more than 100 ways, to hurt somebody.
It's a message not lost on Ronald. He decides he needs more than cameras to protect his home.
It's really disturbing to see something like this between neighbors.
I felt that Ronald Ragland was crazy. Like he's gonna just blow at any minute.
They were on fueling the fire. Neither one of them was going to back down.
You can feel a lot of tension. It was so thick between the Mitchells and the Raglands.
Do not handle me. Get inside.
The feud between Ronald Ragland and the Mitchells has the once peaceful neighborhood of Brandywine on edge.
Why do you always have to be such a jerk?
Leave us alone.
No one wants to be in a neighborhood where something gets so bad in that neighborhood between these two people, these two families.
The security cameras seem to have put an end to the vandalism of Ronald's home. But that doesn't make him feel any better.
Hatred was building up in his heart toward the Mitchell family.
Things are also deteriorating across the street.
I can't make you happy. Like that's possible.
This is not my fault.
The stress of the feud is a burden on Robert and Donna's already troubled marriage.
I don't like the sound of this.
And it takes the ultimate toll.
Me neither.
They felt like they couldn't take it anymore.
This is what you wanted. I thought you wanted.
Robert Sr. and his wife, they separated.
It's a devastating loss for the boys. Ronald appears to delight in their misfortune.
Looks like your mom's leaving that loser of a dad.
His father, Mr. Sr. was a no good bum, and that's why, your mother left you.
You know you're gonna grow up to be just like him.
You're gonna grow up and be nothing and you won't have nothing, just like your dad.
Being the vindictive person that he is, stoop that low. That was pretty low of him to do.
It really hit him really hard, and he didn't like it.
I'm sick of that bastard. Me too. I'm sick of everything.
Roderick makes a shocking announcement.
So I'm moving out too. It's time. You can't do that. Rod! Rod!
Rob Jr. is watching his family fall apart.
My mom and my dad, they were going through what they were going through, and I was in the home. It was just me and my dad.
As far as he's concerned, it's because of Ronald.
He was all alone. Mr. Ragland, he can torture him, say anything to him, because he know that it will get under Robert's skin. Robert was reaching a breaking point.
With his enemies leaving one by one, Ronald is winning the war. But there are still battles to be fought.
He stated that, there were cars coming up, to the house at all hours of the night.
What's up? How you doing?
For Ronald, there can be only one explanation.
He suspected, drug activity going on.
Ronald is not going to let Rob Jr. turn Charm Court into a home for drug dealers.
This is my neighborhood. How dare you come to my neighborhood? How dare you bring this stuff to my neighborhood?
Ronald called the police to my house and told them it was drug activity.
Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dad.
They found some narcotics and they locked Robert up.
You're gonna give him a record.
There's no evidence of Rob Jr. dealing contraband, but it's enough to charge him.
What about his future?
Robert Mitchell Jr. was arrested and charged with possession of drugs.
You be strong when you're down there, son.
He didn't do anything. He's innocent.
I know of him smoking marijuana, but as far as selling drugs, I don't know of him selling drugs.
Because of a joint? Really?
It was a horrible feeling. I was in high school at that time. And I just felt like I wish I never moved there, really. My dad knew that it was wrong and called the police on me.
Robert will always tell me, but he's going to get what he deserved. He's going to get what was coming to him.
Ronald may think he's one step closer to getting rid of the whole Mitchell family. He's wrong.
We ain't going nowhere.
Rob Jr. is back home by day's end.
I ain't going nowhere.
The case was dropped.
Mr. Ragland stated that Robert Mitchell Jr. would, say, I'm going to put a bullet in your head.
You hear me?
Whenever he got a chance to let Mr. Ragland know that, see, you had me arrested, but I'm back. Whatever you do, you're not going to drive us away. We're here to stay.
So he said he definitely felt threatened by Robert Jr.
It just seemed to me like something was going to happen.
And today, the tension reaches its boiling point.
It was a hot day in May, an extremely hot day, and I think that that day was going to be the day.
He just had this stare. It's like a creepy stare.
You know you should be in prison by now. Y'all should be rotting in jail.
Leave us alone. I'm sick of you. Go trim some bushes or something.
He's pacing his driveway, walking back and forth, and, you know, just looking at me, and I'm looking at him like, what's up? Like, what's your beef, you know?
Rob, get in the car. Why don't y'all go back to the ghetto where you belong? Come on, big man. Bring it on.
Rob, come on.
Mr. Ragland was saying, come on, yeah, we're gonna fight. We're gonna fight.
You want some of this? Bring it on.
And Robert is walking out towards the street with, you know, his fist balled up. You know, come on, let's go.
Rob!
When he said those words, bring it on, Mitchell Jr. was willing and ready to do that. And he did. I guess just regret and sorrow that neighbors feuding could get to this point.
It's impacted so many lives, and all for what?
The war between Ronald Ragland, Robert Mitchell Sr., and Rob Mitchell Jr. has taken a bloody turn.
Pressure County 911, what's the location of your emergency?
I need police and ambulance. I need help right now.
I was just scared.
Who got shot?
I just seen blood everywhere.
Listen to me.
He got it.
Lakeisha Gardner was in complete hysterics. She was screaming. She was crying.
Miss Gardner, can you hear me?
It just seemed like, you know, I couldn't get it all out because I just couldn't believe what had happened.
You should be in prison by now. What are you looking at?
The last few minutes have been hell for Lakeisha Gardner.
Sick of you, old man. Why don't you go back to the ghetto where you belong?
Sick.
As Robert's walking towards him, Mr. Ragland starts walking towards Robert.
Look, he's just an idiot. Leave him alone.
My dad sees Ronald approaching me in his rearview mirror, so my dad backs up.
Bring it on.
I was gearing up for a fist fight.
Ronald has other plans.
Mr. Ragland comes from behind his back with a gun and points it at Robert.
I just immediately started scrambling in my yard, you know, trying to get away from him so that he couldn't get a clear shot. When he shot me, I felt immediately. That was the worst feeling ever. It's the worst pain that you can ever possibly imagine.
Once Ragland shoots Mitchell Jr. on the ground, on the lawn, he walks over the car where Mitchell Sr. is sitting in the driver's seat. And shoots him at close range in the side of his head.
I knew my dad was dead.
Please, no, please.
He then walks back over to Mitchell Jr., who's still on the grass, and stands over him, points the gun at him.
Please don't shoot me again. When he was standing over top of me, I just knew I was dead. I mean, I'm kicking him, I'm looking at him, screaming, please don't shoot me no more, don't shoot me no more, please don't shoot me no more.
Ronald is determined to finish off all of his enemies.
you could.
Don't shoot me! Don't stop!
But he's out of bullets.
After Ronald shot me and went back to his home, he was going to go reload.
Lakeisha now has precious seconds to rush Rob to safety.
I threw his arm around my shoulder and I helped him get into the house.
There's blood everywhere. You know, I'm just screaming.
As Rob Jr. fights to hold on, Ronald returns to finish what he started.
Miss Gardner, can you hear me? Listen to me. Listen to me. Are you in immediate danger? Okay, how many? Listen to me.
And he's yelling up at the window to me, come on back outside, come on back outside. You know, you next, come on back outside.
I want you out here. I know you're in there.
Come on out of there! We're not done! Freeze! Turn around! No, drop the gun! Down! Okay. Drop the gun! Drop the gun! How you want?
Police arrive just in time. Ronald Ragland surrenders immediately, then makes a shocking accusation.
He had a gun in the car. He had a gun. He's coming to kill me, man. I had to shoot him.
Mr. Ragland claimed self-defense. He claimed that it was Mitchell Sr. who had a gun.
Mr. Mitchell Sr. was pulling back up to shoot him, and he tried to say, see, the gun was in his car. He was getting ready to shoot me with that gun.
When police search Robert Sr.'s car, they find the gun exactly where Ronald said it would be. But how it got there is another question.
When I walked out, I just couldn't contain my emotions. I was screaming and hollering.
He planted the gun in the car. He hurt Robert.
Lakeisha saw what really happened. Ronald planted the gun. When he returned home to reload, he grabbed a second firearm.
Lakeisha Gardner saw Ronald Ragland carry that gun back over across the street to Mitchell Sr.'s car.
Throwing something into the car.
It appears to police that Ronald had been planning this for a long time.
It's almost as if he had conjured up the scenario and said, if this happens today, this is what I'm going to do.
It's determined he purposely provoked the confrontation.
You should be rotting in prison. Come on, big man.
This wasn't self-defense. It was cold-blooded murder.
He executed Mr. Mitchell and tried to execute Robert Mitchell Jr. Robert would not be here today if Ronald had ran out of bullets.
Ronald Ragland is convicted of second-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, first-degree assault, and use of a handgun in a violent crime. He is sentenced to 40 years in prison.
It's not enough. It's not enough. You take my dad's life, then you try to take my life, you still breathing. You still get to go to court, you know? It's not enough.
When the police brought me out of the house, I seen Mr. Mitchell with nothing covering his body. He was just laying there like helpless. He's just dead.
The Mitchell's family home had foreclosed. Mr. Mitchell, he cared about his family. It seems like all the dreams that Mr. Mitchell had for his family was just fading away.
The door didn't look like the kind that hid monsters. It was painted a soft, forgettable beige. The kind of color you'd pass 100 times in a quiet suburban street without ever noticing. A welcome mat sat just outside, slightly crooked, as if someone had wiped their shoes in a hurry and never bothered to fix it. There were no broken windows. No signs of forced entry. No screams echoing from behind the walls. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels normal until you realize it isn't. When investigators first stepped inside that house in Ontario, they weren't expecting to walk into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Canadian history. They were looking for answers, yes. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would eventually find hidden in drawers, behind ordinary doors, and buried beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. Because this wasn't a house where something went wrong in a single moment of rage. This was a place where something had been growing. Quietly. Patiently. Deliberately. And behind it all were two people who, at first glance, looked like they belonged anywhere but here. Paul Bernardo had the kind of face that didn't raise alarms. Clean-cut. Controlled. The kind of man who could smile politely in conversation and leave you with the impression that everything about him was fine. He moved through the world with a strange confidence, like someone who understood exactly how far he could go without being questioned. And beside him was Carla Homolka. Blonde. Soft-spoken. The kind of woman neighbors described as friendly, even gentle. The kind of person who might wave at you from across the street, who might help you carry groceries, who might laugh easily in casual conversation. Together, they didn't look dangerous. They looked like a couple building a life. But appearances, as it turns out, can be meticulously crafted illusions. Because inside that house, behind that beige door, reality was something else entirely. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't madness in the way people imagine it, loud, erratic, unpredictable. It was controlled. Structured. Recorded. That last part would come to define everything. Because what investigators would eventually uncover wasn't just evidence of crimes. It was documentation. A record of acts so calculated, so methodical, that they blurred the line between impulse and intention, between manipulation and partnership. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all wasn't just what happened inside that house. It was how two people could stand side by side, one long suspected of darkness, the other initially seen as a victim, and create something so deeply, irreversibly horrific together. But to understand that, we need to step back. Back before the house. Back before the tapes. Back before the names of the victims became headlines that spread across the country. Because this story doesn't begin with discovery. It begins with a pattern. A series of shadows moving through the suburbs of Ontario in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Young women walking home alone. Streetlights flickering overhead. A car slowing down just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be remembered. There were reports. Whispers. Fear that traveled quietly from one neighborhood to another. Someone out there was watching. Waiting. Choosing. They called him the Scarborough Rapist. They didn't know his face. But he was already learning something important. How to blend in. How to disappear. How to take and then return to normal life as if nothing had happened. That ability, the ability to live two lives at once, would become the foundation for everything that followed. Because when Paul Bernardo met Karla Homolka, something shifted. Not suddenly. Not in a way anyone could point to and say, that's when it began. But like a slow turn of a key in a lock, something clicked into place. What had once been hidden in darkness began to find a partner. And what had once been solitary became shared. There's a particular kind of horror in crimes committed alone. The isolation, the secrecy, the singular descent into violence. But there is something else, something arguably more disturbing, about crimes committed together. Because partnership requires something more than impulse. It requires understanding, agreement, participation, and sometimes encouragement. In the years that followed, that partnership would be tested, shaped, and ultimately revealed in ways that would shock not just investigators, but an entire country. Because when the truth finally came out, it didn't just expose what had been done. It exposed how it had been done. The planning. The manipulation. The chilling normality of it all. And perhaps most disturbingly, the role each of them played. There's a moment investigators often talk about, not a single event, but a realization. A shift in perception. It happens when a case stops being about isolated incidents and starts becoming something larger. A pattern. A system. A story that has been unfolding right in front of everyone, hidden in plain sight. For this case, that moment came slowly. Piece by piece. Clue by clue. Until eventually, there was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just about one crime. Or even two. It was about a series of acts connected by something deeper than opportunity. Something intentional. And at the center of it all was a question that still lingers, even now. How do you tell the difference between someone who is controlled and someone who chooses to stay? Because in the early days, many believed that Karla Homolka was a victim. A young woman caught in the orbit of a dangerous man. Manipulated. Trapped. Afraid. It was a narrative that made sense. One that people could understand, even sympathize with. But narratives can change. Especially when new evidence comes to light. Especially when the truth is recorded. Somewhere, in that quiet house, there were tapes. And on those tapes was something that would force everyone, investigators, prosecutors, the public, to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Because the question wasn't just what had happened. It was who had truly been involved. And to what extent. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the tapes were found. Before the trials began. Before the world knew their names. There were 3 young girls. Each with a life that had nothing to do with any of this. Each with a future that was supposed to stretch far beyond the quiet streets they walked. And each of them, in ways that still haunt those who remember, crossed paths with something they could never have anticipated. Something that didn't look dangerous. Something that didn't feel like a threat. At least not at first. That's the thing about real horror. It doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with warning signs or dramatic entrances. Sometimes, it arrives quietly. In the form of a passing conversation. A familiar face. A moment that feels ordinary until it isn't. And by the time you realize something is wrong, it's already too late. This is the story of how that happened. How a suburban love story became something far darker. How trust was used as a weapon. And how the truth, when it finally surfaced, left behind a question that still unsettles people to this day. Were there ever really 2 sides to this story? Or had we simply misunderstood the roles they were playing all along? In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the suburbs of Ontario carried a particular kind of quiet confidence. Streets were lined with modest houses, each one nearly identical in shape but softened by personal touches, flower beds carefully arranged, bicycles resting against garage doors, curtains drawn just enough to suggest privacy but not secrecy. It was the kind of place where people believed in routine. Where mornings began with the hum of car engines pulling out of driveways and evenings settled into the glow of television screens behind closed windows. There was comfort in that predictability. Parents believed their children were safe walking to school. Neighbors waved to one another without hesitation. Doors were sometimes left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but out of trust. It was a world that operated on an unspoken agreement that danger existed somewhere else, in places far removed from these quiet, orderly communities. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to fracture. Long before the names would become known, before the headlines would spread fear across the country, there were signs. Subtle at first. Easy to dismiss. A report filed here. A warning whispered there. Incidents that, on their own, didn't seem connected. But taken together, they formed the outline of something far more troubling. Young women in Scarborough began to report attacks. The pattern was unsettling, even if it wasn't immediately clear. The assailant didn't fit a single predictable mold. He struck at night, often targeting women alone, choosing moments when the world seemed to shrink down to a single quiet street and the echo of footsteps. There was a carefulness to it. A sense that whoever was responsible wasn't acting on impulse alone, but on something more deliberate. He watched. He waited. He chose his moments with precision. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished back into the anonymity of suburban life. The media gave him a name, the Scarborough Rapist. It was a name that carried fear, but also distance. A label that allowed people to imagine him as something separate, something identifiable, something that could eventually be caught and removed. But what they didn't understand, what no one could fully grasp at the time, was how seamlessly he blended into the very environment he was terrorizing. Because he wasn't an outsider. He was part of the system. He moved through the same streets, stood in the same lines at grocery stores, exchanged polite smiles with strangers who had no idea what lay beneath that carefully maintained exterior. Paul Bernardo was, by all outward appearances, ordinary. He lived at home with his parents in Scarborough, a detail that, in itself, raised no alarms. Many young adults did the same. His father worked as an accountant. His mother was known to be strict, controlling in ways that might have seemed excessive but not entirely uncommon. From the outside, it was a family that functioned, if not perfectly, then at least convincingly. But inside that home, there were fractures. Paul grew up in an environment marked by tension, secrecy, and contradictions. His father, a man who outwardly maintained respectability, carried his own hidden truths, affairs, deceptions, a double life that would later come to light. His mother, deeply religious and rigid in her expectations, created a household where appearances mattered more than anything else. It was a place where image was everything. Where what people saw from the outside had to remain intact, no matter what was happening behind closed doors. For Paul, that lesson took root early. He learned how to present himself. How to control what others perceived. How to separate what he showed the world from what he kept hidden. In school, he wasn't an outcast. He had friends. He was described as confident, sometimes even charming. There was nothing about him that immediately suggested danger. If anything, he understood how to fit in better than most. But beneath that surface, there were signs, subtle behaviors that, in hindsight, carried more weight than anyone realized at the time. A fascination with control. A need to dominate. A growing disconnect between empathy and action. These weren't things that announced themselves loudly. They didn't disrupt his daily life in obvious ways. Instead, they existed quietly, developing over time, reinforced by a worldview that blurred the lines between desire and entitlement. And as he grew older, those internal patterns began to manifest externally. Not all at once. But gradually. Carefully. By the time the attacks in Scarborough began, Paul had already started to cross boundaries that most people never even approach. And with each incident, he refined his approach. Learned from mistakes. adjusted his behavior. He became more efficient, more controlled, more dangerous. But even then, there was something missing. Because up to that point, everything he had done was solitary. It existed in isolation, contained within the space between his private impulses and the acts he carried out in secret. That would change when he met Carla Homolka. Carla grew up in a different kind of household, one that, on the surface, seemed more stable. Her parents were hardworking. Her upbringing, by most accounts, was conventional. She did well in school. She had friends. She was known for her love of animals, particularly dogs, which she trained and cared for with dedication. There was a softness to her image, a gentleness that people associated with kindness. But like Paul, there were layers that weren't immediately visible. Carla had a strong need for approval. A desire to be seen, to be valued, to be loved in a way that felt complete and consuming. It wasn't unusual in itself, many people share that longing. But in her case, it seemed to run deeper, shaping her choices in ways that would later become impossible to ignore. When she met Paul at a hotel in 1987, the connection was immediate. He was everything she thought she wanted. Confident, charismatic, attentive in a way that felt intense, almost overwhelming. He made her feel chosen, special, as if she occupied a unique space in his world. And for Paul, Carla represented something equally significant. Not just a partner, but an audience. Someone who could validate, reinforce, and eventually participate in the aspects of himself he had kept hidden for so long. Their relationship developed quickly. What began as attraction turned into something more consuming, more intertwined. They spent increasing amounts of time together, their lives gradually merging in ways that felt, from the outside, like the natural progression of a young couple in love. But inside that relationship, dynamics were already forming. Patterns of control. Moments where boundaries blurred. Instances where one person's desires began to override the other's hesitation. It didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through a series of small shifts that, over time, created a new normal. Carla began to adapt, to accommodate, to align herself with Paul's expectations, even when they pushed beyond what might have once felt acceptable. And Paul, in turn, began to test those limits, to see how far he could go, how much she would accept, how deeply she would follow. By the time they moved in together, those dynamics had solidified into something far more complex than a typical relationship. It was no longer just about connection. It was about power, influence, control, and something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore, a shared space where boundaries no longer functioned the way they were supposed to. Outside, life continued as usual. Neighbors saw a couple building a future. Friends observed a relationship that, while intense, didn't immediately signal danger. There were no visible signs that anything was fundamentally wrong. But inside that private world, something was shifting. The line between fantasy and reality was beginning to blur. And once that line disappears, it becomes difficult, sometimes impossible, to redraw. The suburbs of Ontario remained quiet. The routines continued. The sense of safety persisted, even as cracks began to spread beneath the surface. Because the truth is, environments like this don't collapse all at once. They erode slowly. Through moments that seem insignificant until they're connected. Through choices that, on their own, might be dismissed, but together form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. Because what had been developing behind closed doors was no longer contained. It was beginning to reach outward. To extend beyond the boundaries of that relationship. And into the lives of others who had no idea they were about to become part of a story that would change everything. Before the headlines, before the courtroom sketches, before their names were spoken in hushed, horrified tones across an entire country, they were just girls living ordinary lives in quiet Ontario neighborhoods. They had routines, inside jokes, unfinished plans. They left their homes expecting to come back. That is always the detail that lingers the longest, the simple assumption that tomorrow will arrive exactly the way it always has. For 15-year-old Tammy, the world still revolved around small, familiar moments. School, music, laughter with friends, the subtle push and pull of growing up inside a family that both protected and confined her. She was the youngest, the kind of presence that softened a room without trying. There was something unguarded about her, something open. The kind of trust that comes naturally at that age, before life teaches you to question the intentions of the people closest to you. That trust would become the most fragile thing in the room. It was December 1990, and the house was filled with the quiet warmth of a family gathering. Decorations hung in place, not extravagant but enough to signal the season. The kind of night that blends into memory, soft conversations, the clinking of glasses, the faint smell of food lingering in the air. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it felt like the beginning of something irreversible. Tammy was there with her family, surrounded by familiarity. Her older sister moved through the same space, close enough to reach, close enough to reassure. There is something deeply unsettling about how ordinary it all appeared from the outside. No forced entry. No stranger lurking in the shadows. Just a home, filled with people who belonged there. And yet, within that space, a decision had already been made. Tammy didn't know it. She couldn't have known it. The betrayal wasn't something you could see or sense. It didn't come with warning signs or moments of hesitation that might have tipped the balance. It existed quietly, hidden beneath layers of normal behavior, waiting for the exact moment when it could unfold. When it did, it was subtle at first. A shift in atmosphere that no one else in the room could fully perceive. A moment that, to anyone observing from the outside, might have looked like nothing at all. But for Tammy, something changed. The kind of change that is hard to define because it happened so quickly, without explanation. And then, just as quickly, everything began to slip out of reach. What followed would later be described in clinical terms. Words like sedation, overdose, accidental death. Language that creates distance, that softens the edges of something too painful to confront directly. But behind those words was a reality far more personal, far more devastating. A girl who trusted the people around her. A moment where that trust was broken in a way that could never be undone. And a family that, at the time, believed they were witnessing a tragic accident. The official narrative settled quickly. Tammy's death was ruled as an unfortunate combination of alcohol and medication. A mistake. A heartbreaking, but ultimately explainable event. There were no immediate signs pointing to something darker. No evidence that could clearly contradict the conclusion. Life, as it often does, attempted to move forward. Grief settled into the spaces Tammy had once occupied. Her absence became something the family had to learn to live around. Memories took on a sharper edge, each one carrying the weight of what would never happen again. There is a particular kind of silence that follows loss, a silence that isn't empty, but filled with everything that remains unsaid. At that point, no one knew that this was not the end of the story. Not even close. Because while Tammy's death would later be understood as the beginning of something far more sinister, the world outside that house continued to turn. Other lives continued to unfold, unaware of the connection that would soon bind them together in a way no one could have imagined. In another part of Ontario, 17-year-old Leslie moved through her days with the quiet independence of someone on the edge of adulthood. She was at that in-between stage, where childhood was beginning to loosen its grip, but the full weight of the adult world hadn't yet settled in. She had friends, routines, a sense of self that was still forming but already distinct. The night she disappeared, there was nothing extraordinary about her plans. That is often the case. The moments that change everything rarely announce themselves as important. They blend into the ordinary, into decisions made without a second thought. Leslie had been out with friends. Laughter, conversation, the kind of easy energy that comes with being young and surrounded by people who know you. At some point, she found herself locked out of her house. It was inconvenient, frustrating, but not dangerous. Not in a neighborhood like hers. Not under circumstances that felt so familiar. So she waited. That small decision, to stay outside, to linger in the space between going home and finding another option, would become the turning point. Because somewhere nearby, someone was watching. The streetlights cast uneven pools of light across the pavement. Shadows stretched and shifted with the slightest movement. It was quiet in the way suburban nights often are, calm, predictable, deceptively safe. And then a car slowed down. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would immediately trigger alarm. Just enough to suggest interest. Just enough to create a moment of uncertainty. Leslie couldn't have known what that moment meant. She couldn't have known that she had just crossed into someone else's plan. What happened next unfolded quickly, but not chaotically. There was a structure to it, a sequence that had been imagined long before it was executed. The approach, the interaction, the shift from normalcy to something else entirely, it followed a path that had already been rehearsed in the mind of the person carrying it out. Leslie disappeared that night. At first, it was confusion. A missed check-in. A delay that didn't quite make sense. Then concern. Calls made, questions asked, the slow realization that something was wrong. As hours turned into days, that concern hardened into fear. Her family searched. Friends retraced steps, revisiting places she had been, conversations she had had. Each piece of information felt like it might lead somewhere, might offer clarity, might bring her back. But she didn't come back. When her remains were eventually discovered, the reality of what had happened began to take shape. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something deliberate. Something planned. And somewhere, the person responsible was still out there. Still moving through the same streets. Still blending into the same environment that had allowed them to act without being seen. The fear that followed wasn't loud at first. It spread quietly, from one conversation to another, from one household to the next. Parents became more cautious. Curfews tightened. The sense of safety that had once defined these neighborhoods began to shift, replaced by a question that no one could quite answer. Who could do something like this? And perhaps more importantly, how had they gone unnoticed? That question would only grow more urgent in the months that followed. Because Leslie was not the last. In April 1992, 14-year-old Kristen was walking home from school. It was the middle of the day, a time when the world is supposed to feel most visible, most secure. There were people around. Cars passing by. The ordinary movement of daily life continuing as it always did. Kristen was not alone in the sense that she was isolated. But she was alone enough. She walked along a familiar route, one she had likely taken many times before. There is a comfort in repetition, in knowing the path ahead, in trusting that each step will lead you exactly where it always has. That trust was about to be broken. Witnesses would later recall seeing her near an intersection. A couple nearby. Nothing immediately alarming. Nothing that demanded urgent attention. The kind of interaction that blends into the background of a normal day. But normality can be deceptive. What those witnesses couldn't have known was that they were observing the beginning of something far more significant. A moment that, in hindsight, would be dissected, analyzed, revisited over and over again in an attempt to understand how it had happened in plain sight. Kristen never made it home. The realization came quickly. Too quickly. There was no long period of uncertainty, no gradual escalation from concern to panic. The moment she failed to arrive, something felt wrong. Deeply, instinctively wrong. Search efforts began almost immediately. Volunteers gathered. Flyers were distributed. Her face appeared on television screens, in newspapers, in the hands of strangers who suddenly found themselves part of something they had never expected to be involved in. There is a particular kind of fear that grips a community when a child goes missing in daylight. It doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel abstract. It feels immediate, personal, as if the boundaries that once separated safety from danger have suddenly dissolved. For Kristen's family, that fear was constant. Every passing hour carried weight. Every unanswered question became heavier. The not knowing, the space between what had happened and what could be proven, was its own kind of torment. And somewhere, behind closed doors, the answers already existed. But they were not being shared. Not yet. Because the story of these girls, their lives, their final moments, the way they became connected to something far larger than themselves, was still unfolding. And the people responsible were still free. Still watching. Still deciding what would happen next. There is a moment, in every case like this, where intention becomes action. A point where thoughts that once existed only in the privacy of the mind cross into the real world, where imagination hardens into something irreversible. It doesn't always happen with violence at first. Sometimes, it begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, in choices that seem small until they are placed side by side. For Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, that shift had already begun long before anyone else realized it. It was present in conversations that no one else heard, in agreements that were never spoken aloud in public, in a private language of understanding that grew stronger with time. By the time December 1990 arrived, the boundary between thought and action had already been crossed. The house was warm that night. Familiar. Safe, at least in the way that homes are supposed to be. Decorations marked the season, subtle reminders that this was a time of gathering, of closeness, of family. There were voices moving through the rooms, the soft rhythm of conversation rising and falling, blending into a background hum that felt ordinary. Inside that environment, Tammy moved as she always had. Comfortable. Unaware. Her presence was woven into the space, part of the natural order of things. She had no reason to question the people around her. No reason to sense that anything was wrong. But elsewhere in that same house, something had already been set in motion. The decision was not spontaneous. It didn't emerge from a sudden argument or an uncontrolled burst of anger. It had been considered, discussed, shaped over time until it became something that could be acted upon. That is what makes moments like this so difficult to comprehend. Not the fact that they happen, but the way they are allowed to develop, quietly, without interruption, until they reach a point where stopping is no longer part of the equation. When the act itself began, it did so without spectacle. There were no loud confrontations, no immediate signs of struggle that would draw attention. Instead, it unfolded in a controlled environment, within reach of others who had no idea what was taking place. Tammy trusted the people closest to her. That trust created an opening. What followed would later be described in fragments, reconstructed through evidence, testimony, and the chilling clarity of hindsight. A sequence of actions that, at the time, were hidden behind normal behavior, concealed within the structure of a family gathering. The shift was subtle, but once it began, it moved in only one direction. There are moments when time seems to stretch, when seconds feel longer than they should, when the space between one action and the next becomes almost tangible. For Tammy, that moment came without warning. A transition from familiarity to something she could not fully understand. Confusion. Disorientation. A growing sense that something was not right. But by then, the control had already shifted. In another part of the house, voices continued. Laughter, perhaps. The quiet sounds of a family existing in shared space. No one outside that immediate moment could see what was happening. No one could step in, could interrupt, could change the course of what had already begun. When it was over, the narrative that followed was one of accident. A tragic mistake. Something that, while heartbreaking, could be explained within the boundaries of normal human error. That explanation held. For a time. long enough for life to attempt to return to its previous shape. But the truth, as it often does, remained just beneath the surface, waiting. And for Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, that moment did not mark an end. It marked a beginning. Because once a boundary has been crossed once, it becomes easier to cross again. The next phase didn't happen immediately. It rarely does. There is often a period of recalibration, a time where what has been done is processed, justified, absorbed into a new sense of normal. For them, that period was filled with something that resembled ordinary life. Work. Daily routines. Interactions with others that gave no indication of what had already taken place. But beneath that surface, something had changed. The line that separates thought from action had been erased. And without that line, the possibilities expanded. By June 1991, the pattern had evolved. The night Leslie Mahaffey was taken did not begin as something extraordinary. It followed the same structure as countless other nights in quiet suburban neighborhoods. People moved through their routines. Lights turned off one by one. Streets settled into stillness. Leslie found herself locked out of her house. It was a small detail, almost insignificant in isolation. The kind of inconvenience that happens without consequence. But in this case, it created an opening. An opportunity. Somewhere nearby, a car moved through the darkness. Not erratically. Not in a way that would immediately draw attention. It followed the flow of the street, blending into the environment, becoming part of the background rather than standing apart from it. Inside that car, decisions were being made in real time. Not whether to act. That had already been decided. But how? How to approach? How to control the situation? How to ensure that what happened next would unfold according to plan? Leslie stood outside her home, caught in that in-between space where options feel limited but not yet dangerous. She could wait. She could try to find help. She could make a different choice. But timing is everything. And on that night, timing worked against her. The car slowed. A moment of interaction followed. What was said, exactly how it unfolded, is something that can never be fully reconstructed. But what is clear is that within a short span of time, control shifted once again. From Leslie to them. The transition was not chaotic. It was deliberate. Structured. A sequence of actions that moved forward with a kind of quiet efficiency. And then she was gone. Not in a way that left immediate evidence. Not in a way that created a scene. Just gone. The house she had been trying to enter remained unchanged. The street looked the same. The night continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Inside their home, the environment was controlled in a way that the outside world could not see. It was isolated, contained, designed to allow actions to unfold without interruption. Time moved differently there, shaped not by routine, but by intention. Leslie was held for days. That fact alone speaks to a level of planning that goes beyond impulse. It suggests preparation, foresight, an understanding of how to maintain control over an extended period. But what makes this case particularly disturbing is not just what was done, but how it was preserved. Recorded. The presence of video changes everything. It transforms an act from something that exists only in memory into something that can be revisited, replayed, examined. It creates a permanent record, one that reflects not just the actions themselves, but the mindset behind them. And in that space, within that house, those recordings became part of the process. A way of capturing control. Of reinforcing it. Of turning something already horrific into something even more calculated. When Leslie's life was taken, it was not the result of a sudden escalation. It was the conclusion of a sequence that had been set in motion long before that night. And when it was over, the process of concealment began. Carefully. Deliberately. Because maintaining the illusion of normalcy required more than just committing the act. It required ensuring that it remained hidden, that the outside world continued to see nothing out of place. And for a time, that illusion held. Until April 1992. Until Kristen French walked home from school. Daylight changes the equation. It removes the cover of darkness, replaces it with visibility, with the presence of others, with the expectation that nothing truly dangerous can happen in plain sight. That expectation would be shattered. Kristen's walk home was routine. Familiar. A path she had taken before, one that connected the safety of school with the safety of home. There were people around. Cars passing. The normal movement of a community in the middle of the day. And yet, within that environment, a moment appeared. A brief window where attention shifted, where focus moved elsewhere, where something could happen without immediate interruption. A couple approached. The presence of a woman changes perception. It lowers defenses. Creates a sense of trust where there might otherwise be hesitation. Witnesses would later recall seeing this interaction. At the time, it did not appear alarming. Just another moment in a day filled with countless similar moments. But within that interaction, control shifted once again. From Kristen to them. What followed happened quickly. Efficiently. In a way that left little room for resistance, little time for intervention. And then she was gone. Taken from a public space in broad daylight. The kind of act that doesn't just affect one family, but an entire community. Because if something like this can happen here, in this moment, under these conditions, then where is safety? That question would linger long after the details began to emerge. Inside that same house, the pattern repeated. Control. Containment. Documentation. Days passed. And once again, the outside world had no immediate access to what was happening within those walls. When Kristen's life was taken, it followed the same structure as before. A sequence. A process. A conclusion that had been moving toward that point from the moment she was approached. And when it was over, the cycle of concealment began again. But by then, the pattern had grown too large to remain hidden indefinitely. Too many connections. Too many overlapping details. Too many lives affected. The incidents were no longer isolated. They were part of something bigger. Something that was beginning to leave traces. And those traces would eventually lead back to the place where it had all been happening. Behind that beige door. In a house that, from the outside, still looked completely ordinary. The first signs did not come all at once. They never do. Instead, they emerged in fragments, disconnected pieces of information that, at first glance, seemed incomplete, even unrelated. A report filed in one district. A timeline that didn't quite align. A detail that lingered longer than it should have in the mind of an investigator who couldn't yet explain why it mattered. In cases like this, discovery is rarely a single moment. It is a slow accumulation. A process of noticing, questioning, revisiting. It is built on instinct as much as evidence, the quiet insistence that something is wrong, even when there is not yet enough to prove it. For the disappearance of Leslie Mahaffey, the investigation began with urgency. Missing persons cases involving young individuals tend to move quickly, driven by the understanding that time is not an ally. Officers canvass neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, hoping that repetition might unlock something overlooked. When was the last time you saw her? Did anything seem unusual? Did you notice any unfamiliar vehicles? The answers, at first, were predictable. No. Nothing. Everything seemed normal. That word, normal, appeared again and again, as if it could somehow explain the absence of something that clearly did not fit within it. But absence itself is a kind of evidence. Leslie had been outside her home. That much was certain. The fact that she never made it inside narrowed the window. Reduced the possibilities. It suggested that whatever had happened, it had occurred within a very specific span of time. That detail mattered. Because it meant someone had been there. Someone had seen her. Someone had acted. As days passed, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had begun as a search became something else. Something heavier. The realization that this was not a situation that would resolve with a simple explanation. When Leslie's remains were eventually found, the case moved into a different phase. The unknown began to take shape, though not fully. There were still gaps, still questions that resisted easy answers. But there was enough to understand that this was not random. There was intention behind it. Planning. Control. Those elements became central to the investigation, shaping the way detectives approached the case. They were no longer just looking for someone who had committed a crime. They were looking for someone who had done so in a specific way, someone who had demonstrated a pattern, even if that pattern was not yet fully visible. At the same time, the broader context began to surface. The attacks in Scarborough. The reports that had been filed months, even years earlier. Individually, they had been treated as separate incidents. But now, in light of what had happened to Leslie, they began to take on new significance. Could there be a connection? It was a question that lingered, difficult to answer but impossible to ignore. The problem was that connections require evidence. And at that stage, evidence was limited. There were no clear witnesses to Leslie's abduction. No definitive description of a suspect. No immediate physical link that could tie one case to another in a way that would hold under scrutiny. What investigators had instead were impressions. Patterns that seemed to align, but not quite enough to confirm. A sense that they were looking at something larger than a single event. And then, less than a year later, Kristen French disappeared. The circumstances were different, but the effect was immediate. Public fear escalated. The idea that one incident might be isolated became harder to maintain. Two cases, both involving young girls, both occurring within a relatively close geographic area, both lacking clear explanations, it was no longer possible to dismiss the possibility of a connection. The investigation intensified. Resources were expanded. More officers were brought in. Information began to move more quickly between departments, though not always as efficiently as it needed to. There were still barriers, jurisdictional limits, procedural constraints, the natural friction that occurs when multiple agencies attempt to work together under pressure. But the urgency was undeniable. Kristen's disappearance introduced something new into the investigative process: witnesses. People who had seen something. Not everything. Not enough to provide a complete picture. But enough to suggest that her final moments had not been entirely hidden. A couple. That detail surfaced more than once. A man and a woman together. It was an unusual element. Most cases of this nature involve a single perpetrator. The presence of two individuals introduced a layer of complexity that investigators had to consider carefully. Were the witnesses reliable? Had they interpreted what they saw correctly? Could it have been an unrelated couple, present at the wrong place at the wrong time? Each possibility had to be explored, tested against the available evidence. At the same time, the investigative team began to revisit older cases with renewed focus. The Scarborough attacks, in particular, drew attention. There were similarities in behavior, in the apparent method of approach, in the calculated nature of the crimes. But similarities are not proof. They are starting points. To move beyond them, investigators needed something concrete. Something that could bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. That something began to emerge through forensic evidence. Advancements in DNA analysis, still developing at the time, offered new possibilities. Biological samples collected from earlier cases were re-examined, compared, analyzed with greater precision than had been possible before. The process was meticulous. Slow. Each test carried weight, each result the potential to confirm or eliminate a connection that had, until then, existed only as a theory. And gradually, a picture began to form. Not complete. Not yet. But clearer than it had been before. There was a link. A biological thread connecting multiple incidents. It pointed toward a single individual. Someone who had been active in the Scarborough area. Someone who had managed to avoid detection despite repeated offenses. The challenge now was identifying that individual. And that is where the investigation began to encounter its most frustrating obstacle. Because even with DNA evidence suggesting a connection, there was no immediate match. No name attached to the profile. No entry in the system that could provide a direct lead. It was like having a fingerprint without a hand to match it to. At the same time, tips continued to come in. Some useful. Many not. In high-profile cases, information flows rapidly, but not always accurately. Investigators must sift through it, separating what might matter from what clearly does not. It is a process that requires patience, discipline, and the ability to remain focused even when progress feels slow. Meanwhile, life outside the investigation continued. People went to work. Children went to school, though often under stricter supervision. Communities adapted, adjusting their sense of normal to accommodate a new awareness of risk. But beneath that adaptation, the question remained. Who was responsible? And how had they managed to remain hidden for so long? The answer, when it began to take shape, did not come from a single breakthrough. It came from convergence. Multiple lines of inquiry, each incomplete on its own, beginning to intersect. A name surfaced. At first, it was just another possibility. One among many. But as investigators looked closer, as they compared timelines, behaviors, known associations, that name began to carry more weight. Paul Bernardo. He fit certain aspects of the profile. He had been in the area during the time of the Scarborough attacks. There were behavioral indicators that aligned with what investigators had been observing. But suspicion is not enough. It must be supported, tested, confirmed. And that is where the process slowed once again. Because building a case requires more than identifying a potential suspect. It requires evidence that can withstand scrutiny. Evidence that can connect actions to an individual in a way that leaves no room for doubt. At that stage, investigators were still gathering. Still piecing together. Still working toward a point where they could move forward with confidence. What they did not yet fully understand was how close they were. Because the answers they were searching for were not scattered across distant locations. They were concentrated. Contained within a single environment. A house that, from the outside, appeared no different from any other. Inside that house were details that would eventually change everything. Objects that held meaning far beyond their ordinary appearance. And recordings, evidence that did not just suggest what had happened, but captured it in a way that could not be ignored. But those discoveries had not yet been made. For now, the investigation remained in motion. Advancing. Stalling. Advancing again. Each step bringing them closer, even if it did not yet feel that way. Because in cases like this, the truth does not reveal itself all at once. It waits. Until enough pieces are in place. Until the right questions are asked. Until the moment when everything aligns. And when that moment comes, it changes not just the direction of the investigation, but the understanding of everything that came before. That moment was approaching. Slowly. Inevitably. And when it arrived, it would reveal just how much had been hidden in plain sight. By the time investigators began to seriously consider that they were dealing with something larger than isolated crimes, the pressure had already begun to mount. Not just from within the police force, but from the public, from the media, from families who needed answers that no one could yet provide. The disappearance of one girl had been terrifying. The disappearance of another made it impossible to ignore. Patterns were no longer theoretical. They were real, and they were unfolding in real time. Inside the investigative teams, there was a growing sense that they were chasing something just out of reach. Leads came in, but many dissolved under scrutiny. Witness descriptions were inconsistent, sometimes vague, sometimes conflicting. Memory is fragile under stress, and what people believe they saw does not always align with what actually happened. Still, every detail had to be examined, cross-referenced, considered from multiple angles. The idea of a couple being involved complicated everything. Most investigative frameworks at the time were built around a single offender model. One individual, acting alone, driven by a specific psychological profile. But here, there were indications, uncertain, but persistent, that more than one person might be involved. A man and a woman seen together near the last known location of a victim. It was an anomaly, something that didn't fit cleanly into existing assumptions. Some investigators hesitated to fully embrace that possibility. Not because it was impossible, but because it introduced a level of complexity that made the case exponentially more difficult. Two offenders meant two sets of behaviors, two motivations, two variables that could shift independently or in coordination. It meant a partnership. And partnerships, especially in crimes of this nature, are rare. But rare does not mean non-existent. As the investigation expanded, so did the number of individuals under scrutiny. Lists were compiled. Names added, removed, added again. Men with prior offenses. Individuals who lived in proximity to the victims. People whose behavior raised questions, even if those questions could not yet be answered definitively. Among those names, one continued to resurface. Paul Bernardo. At first, it was not a strong lead. More of a possibility, supported by circumstantial elements rather than direct evidence. He had lived in Scarborough during the period of the earlier assaults. His timeline overlapped with known incidents. There were behavioral indicators that aligned with what investigators had begun to piece together. But alignment is not confirmation. And without confirmation, action is limited. Investigators began to look closer. Background checks. Interviews with people who knew him. Observations of his daily routine. On the surface, there was little to distinguish him from countless others. He had a job. A relationship. A life that appeared stable, even ordinary. That ordinariness was part of the problem. Because it allowed him to exist without drawing attention. At the same time, forensic evidence continued to be analyzed. The DNA profile that had been extracted from earlier cases remained a central focus. It was a thread that connected multiple incidents, a piece of evidence that suggested continuity where there might otherwise have been doubt. But without a match, it remained incomplete. Investigators began to consider more aggressive approaches. Surveillance. Covert observation. The idea was not to act prematurely, but to gather enough information to justify the next step. To move from suspicion to something that could be tested, challenged, verified. While this was happening, another layer of the case was developing, one that would prove to be just as significant, if not more so. Carla Homolka. At that stage, she was not viewed as a suspect in the same way. If anything, her position was ambiguous. She was connected to Paul Bernardo, that much was clear. Their relationship was known. They lived together. They were, from all outward appearances, a couple building a life. But relationships can conceal as much as they reveal. There were moments, small at first, where her name appeared in connection with the investigation. Not as a central figure, but as part of the broader context. Someone who might have seen something, heard something, known something. The possibility that she could be more than that she could be actively involved, was not yet fully realized. And that gap in perception would have consequences. Because while investigators were building their case, gathering evidence piece by piece, time continued to pass. And with time, the risk of losing critical information increased. Memories fade. Physical evidence degrades. Opportunities narrow. In high-pressure investigations, timing is everything. Too soon, and you risk acting without sufficient evidence. Too late, and you risk losing the chance to act at all. The balance is delicate, and in this case, it was further complicated by factors that were not immediately visible. There were delays. Procedural obstacles. Moments where information did not move as quickly or as efficiently as it needed to. The DNA profile, for example, while crucial, did not immediately lead to identification. It required comparison, processing, the kind of systematic analysis that takes time. And during that time, the individual connected to that profile continued to move freely. Investigators were aware of the risk. But awareness does not always translate into immediate action. There are protocols. Standards that must be met. Thresholds that must be crossed before certain steps can be taken. And in the space between knowing and proving, cases can stall. But they do not stop. Gradually, the focus on Paul Bernardo intensified. There were inconsistencies in his background. Details that, when examined closely, did not align as neatly as they should have. Behavioral patterns that raised questions. Nothing definitive on its own. But together, they began to form a picture that was difficult to ignore. The next step required something more direct. A sample. DNA. If investigators could obtain a sample from him and compare it to the existing profile, they could confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. But obtaining that sample was not as simple as it might seem. Legal constraints applied. Procedures had to be followed. And until those procedures were completed, the investigation remained in a state of tension, close to a breakthrough, but not yet there. Meanwhile, the possibility of a second participant continued to linger. The reports of a couple. The presence of a woman. These elements did not fit easily into the framework of a single offender case. They required investigators to consider scenarios that were less common, less familiar. And with that came uncertainty. Was the woman an accomplice? A witness? A victim herself? Each possibility carried different implications, different investigative paths. At that stage, there was no clear answer. Only questions. And those questions would persist until something shifted. That shift did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from the accumulation of many. A pattern that became too consistent to dismiss. A connection that became too strong to ignore. And eventually, a moment where the balance tipped. Where suspicion moved into something more concrete. Where the investigation, after months of uncertainty, began to narrow in a way that felt decisive. But even then, the full scope of what had happened was not yet understood. Investigators were closing in on a suspect. They were building a case. They were preparing to act. What they did not yet fully grasp was how much remained hidden. How much had been contained within the private space of that relationship. How much evidence existed beyond what they had already uncovered. And how that evidence, once revealed, would not just confirm their suspicions, but transform the entire narrative of the case. Because up to that point, the investigation had been focused on identifying the perpetrator. Soon, it would have to confront something far more complex. The reality that this was not the story of one individual acting alone, but of two people, bound together in a way that defied simple explanation. And the deeper investigators went, the more that reality would begin to surface. Piece by piece. Until there was no way to look away. The turning point did not arrive like a thunderclap. There was no single moment where everything suddenly became clear, no dramatic revelation that instantly connected every loose thread. Instead, it came the way most breakthroughs do in cases like this, quietly at first, almost unnoticeable, buried within the routine progression of investigative work. But once it began, it could not be stopped. The investigation had already narrowed. The focus on Paul Bernardo was no longer tentative. It had moved beyond speculation into something more grounded, supported by patterns that aligned too closely to ignore. The timeline fit. The behavioral indicators matched. The geographic overlap was significant. What investigators needed now was confirmation. And that confirmation came through science. When the DNA sample was finally obtained and analyzed, the result was not ambiguous. It did not require interpretation or debate. It was definitive. A match. The biological evidence from the Scarborough assaults, the crimes that had once seemed disconnected from everything else, pointed directly to Paul Bernardo. After years of uncertainty, the identity of the Scarborough rapist was no longer a question. It was him. That realization alone was enough to change the direction of the investigation. It confirmed that the individual responsible for a series of violent assaults had been living undetected within the community, maintaining a normal life while carrying out acts that had left lasting trauma in their wake. But as significant as that discovery was, it was only part of the truth. Because the Scarborough assaults were not the only crimes under investigation. And the question that now took center stage was unavoidable. If Paul Bernardo was responsible for those earlier attacks, what else had he done? The connection to the more recent cases, the disappearances of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, was still being built. There were similarities, yes. Behavioral echoes that suggested continuity. But investigators needed more than similarity. They needed evidence. And that is where the case took an unexpected turn. The shift began with something that, on its own, might have seemed unrelated. A fracture in the relationship between Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. From the outside, their relationship had always appeared intense, but stable. They were seen together. They presented themselves as a unit. There was nothing to suggest that anything was fundamentally wrong. But inside the relationship, tensions had been building. Patterns of control, which had once been subtle, had become more visible. Arguments, conflicts, moments where the balance of power shifted in ways that were harder to conceal. And eventually, those tensions reached a point where they could no longer remain contained. Carla left. It was a decisive break, one that created a separation not just physically, but psychologically. For the first time, she was no longer within the immediate influence of Paul Bernardo's presence. The environment that had shaped her behavior, that had reinforced certain patterns, was no longer constant. And in that space, something changed. What she chose to do next would alter the course of the investigation entirely. At first, her statements were framed in a specific way. She presented herself as a victim. Someone who had been controlled, manipulated, forced into situations she did not want to be part of. She described a relationship defined by dominance and submission, where her role had been shaped by fear and coercion. It was a narrative that investigators had to consider carefully. Because it was plausible. There are cases where individuals are drawn into criminal activity through manipulation, where the dynamics of a relationship create conditions that limit choice, that distort perception, that make resistance feel impossible. But plausibility is not proof. And investigators, by this point, had learned to look beyond initial narratives. Still, Carla's willingness to speak was significant. She provided details. Information that had not been available before. Descriptions of events, locations, actions that began to fill in the gaps that had previously seemed impossible to bridge. Her account connected Paul Bernardo to the disappearances of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French in a way that had not yet been fully established through physical evidence alone. It was a breakthrough. But it came with complications. Because in exchange for her cooperation, a decision was made. A deal. Carla Homolka would plead guilty to lesser charges in return for her testimony against Paul Bernardo. The agreement was reached at a time when investigators and prosecutors did not yet have access to all the evidence that would later emerge. At that moment, it seemed like a necessary step. They had a primary suspect. They had a cooperating witness. They had the opportunity to build a case strong enough to ensure a conviction. But what they did not yet fully understand was how much of the story remained hidden. Because even as Carla was providing her account, even as the legal process began to move forward, there were still pieces of evidence that had not been discovered. Evidence that existed within the very space where the crimes had taken place. Inside the house. It was during the search of that house that the investigation crossed another threshold. Officers moved through the space methodically, documenting, collecting, analyzing. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary. Furniture, personal belongings, the remnants of a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. But investigators had learned by then that appearances could be deceptive. They looked deeper. Drawers were opened. Containers examined. Items that might have seemed insignificant were catalogued, preserved, reviewed. And then, they found them. Videotapes. At first, they were just objects. Unlabeled. Unremarkable. But in a case like this, nothing is dismissed without examination. When those tapes were finally reviewed, the investigation changed in a way that no one had anticipated. Because what they contained was not just evidence. It was documentation. A record of events that had previously existed only in fragments, testimony, forensic findings, circumstantial connections. Now, those events were visible in a way that could not be argued, could not be reinterpreted, could not be softened by narrative. The tapes showed what had happened. And more importantly, they showed who had been involved. The image of Karla Homolka as a passive participant, as someone acting purely under coercion, began to fracture. Because the recordings revealed something else. Active involvement. Participation that went beyond what had been initially described. Moments where her role was not that of someone being forced, but someone engaging. That discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. And beyond it. Because by that point, the deal had already been made. The agreement that limited her sentence in exchange for her testimony had been finalized before the full extent of her involvement was understood. It was a moment that would later be described in stark terms. A miscalculation. A gap between what was known and what could have been known. But at the time, it was irreversible. The focus remained on building the case against Paul Bernardo. With the DNA evidence, with Karla's testimony, with the material recovered from the house, the foundation was strong. Stronger than it had ever been. The narrative that had once been fragmented was now cohesive. The connections that had once been speculative were now supported by tangible proof. The investigation had reached the point where action was no longer just possible. It was inevitable. Paul Bernardo was arrested. The man who had moved through suburban neighborhoods undetected, who had maintained the appearance of normalcy while committing acts that defied comprehension, was now in custody. But even as that chapter of the case reached its conclusion, another was just beginning. Because the discovery of those tapes did more than provide evidence. It forced a re-examination of everything that had come before. The roles people had played. The decisions that had been made. The assumptions that had shaped the investigation. And perhaps most importantly, it introduced a question that would linger long after the trial. Not just about guilt, but about responsibility. Because the truth, once revealed, was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. And it would challenge the way this case was understood for years to come. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story had already gripped an entire nation. It was no longer confined to police reports or investigative files. It lived in headlines, in conversations between strangers, in the quiet tension that settled over communities trying to reconcile what had happened with the world they thought they understood. The names Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were no longer unfamiliar. They carried weight now, heavy with implication, surrounded by questions that demanded answers. The courtroom itself became a stage where those answers would be sought, though not always found in the way people expected. It was a controlled environment, structured by rules, guided by procedure. But beneath that structure, there was something far less orderly. Emotion, tension, the quiet undercurrent of anger and grief that could not be fully contained by legal formality. Paul Bernardo sat at the center of it all, no longer the anonymous figure investigators had once been searching for, no longer hidden behind the illusion of an ordinary life. Now, every movement, every expression was observed, analyzed, interpreted. There is a particular stillness that surrounds defendants in cases like this. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of suspended attention, where every detail takes on meaning. He did not appear as the image many had constructed in their minds. There was no outward display of chaos, no visible unraveling. Instead, there was composure. Controlled, measured, almost detached. The kind of presence that forces people to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the most disturbing actions are not always carried out by those who appear visibly disturbed. Across the courtroom, the prosecution began to lay out its case. It was methodical, deliberate, built piece by piece, each element reinforcing the next. The DNA evidence came first, grounding the case in something undeniable. It connected Paul Bernardo to the earlier assaults, establishing a pattern of behavior that extended back years before the murders. It was not just about proving that he had committed those acts. It was about demonstrating continuity, showing that the violence did not emerge suddenly, but evolved over time. Then came the connection to Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The timeline. The circumstances of their disappearances. The similarities that, once examined in detail, could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Each element was presented with care, not rushed, not overstated, but allowed to stand on its own weight. And then, inevitably, the focus shifted to the evidence recovered from the house. The videotapes. They were not shown in full. They did not need to be. Even the acknowledgement of their existence carried enough weight to alter the atmosphere in the room. The idea that these events had been recorded, preserved, transformed into something that could be replayed, it changed the way the case was perceived. This was not just a series of crimes. It was something more calculated, more deliberate, more disturbing. The prosecution used those recordings not as spectacle, but as confirmation. A way to reinforce what had already been established through other forms of evidence. A way to remove doubt, to replace uncertainty with clarity. And within that clarity, another reality emerged. The role of Kala Homoka. By the time of the trial, her position in the case was already defined by the agreement she had made. She had pleaded guilty to lesser charges. She had provided testimony. Her role, legally, had been established. But legally defined does not always mean fully understood. When her involvement was discussed in court, it was done within the boundaries of that agreement. Her testimony focused on Paul Bernardo's actions, on the dynamics of their relationship, on the ways in which she had been influenced, controlled, shaped by his behavior. It was a narrative that had been accepted, formalized, integrated into the legal framework of the case. But outside the courtroom, and even within it, there was tension. Because the discovery of the videotapes had introduced doubt. Not about what had happened, but about how it had been represented. The public had become aware that her involvement might have been more active than initially believed. That the distinction between victim and participant was not as clear as it had once seemed. But the courtroom is not a place for revisiting agreements already made. It is a place for applying the law within the structure that has been established. And within that structure, the focus remained on Paul Bernardo. The defense faced an overwhelming challenge. The evidence was substantial. The connections were strong. The narrative, as presented by the prosecution, was cohesive and supported by multiple forms of proof. In such cases, the defense often shifts its approach. It does not attempt to deny every element, but instead seeks to introduce doubt, to question the interpretation of evidence, to suggest alternative explanations where possible. But here, the space for doubt was limited. The DNA evidence was definitive. The testimonies were consistent. The physical evidence supported the conclusions being drawn. The defense could challenge details, question procedures, highlight inconsistencies, but it could not dismantle the core of the case. As the trial progressed, the emotional weight became more apparent. Families of the victims were present. Their presence was not loud, not disruptive, but it was constant. A reminder that this was not just about evidence or legal arguments. It was about lives that had been taken. Futures that had been erased. Moments that would never happen. For them, the courtroom was not just a place of justice. It was a place of confrontation. A place where they were forced to sit in proximity to the person responsible, to hear details they might have preferred not to know, to relive, in fragments, the events that had already caused them unimaginable pain. There is no procedure that can fully account for that. no structure that can contain it. It exists alongside the legal process, intersecting with it, but never fully merging. When the time came for the verdict, the atmosphere shifted once again. Anticipation. Tension. The sense that everything had been leading to this moment. The decision, when it was delivered, was clear. Paul Bernardo was found guilty. The charges reflected the severity of his actions, the extent of the harm he had caused, the pattern of behavior that had been established over time. The sentence was life imprisonment. A conclusion that, within the framework of the law, represented the strongest possible response. But even as the verdict was announced, even as the sentence was imposed, there was an awareness that something remained unresolved. Because justice, in cases like this, is not a simple equation. It is not a balance where one outcome cancels out another. It is a process, imperfect, shaped by the information available at the time decisions are made. And in this case, one of those decisions continued to cast a shadow. The agreement with Karla Homolka. 12 years. That was the sentence she received. For her role. For her involvement. For the actions that, as the evidence suggested, extended beyond what had initially been understood. The reaction was immediate. Public outrage. A sense that something had gone wrong, not in the identification of the perpetrator, but in the distribution of accountability. The phrase began to circulate. A deal with the devil. It captured the essence of the frustration, the belief that in securing one conviction, the system had compromised too much in another direction. But the legal system does not operate on hindsight. It operates on the information available at the time. And at the time the agreement was made, the full extent of Karla's involvement had not yet been revealed. That does not change the outcome. It only explains how it came to be. As the trial concluded, as the formal process reached its end, the case transitioned into something else. A subject of analysis. Of debate. Of reflection. Because while the courtroom had delivered a verdict, it had also exposed the limitations of the system. The gaps between knowledge and timing. The consequences of decisions made under uncertainty. And the reality that justice, even when achieved, can still feel incomplete. For the families, for the public, for those who had followed the case from the beginning, that when the courtroom doors finally closed and the gavel fell, the story did not end. In fact, for many, it had only just begun. Outside, the world seemed impossibly normal. People walked the streets, children played in parks, cars moved along streets that had once been haunted by fear. But beneath that surface, the reverberations of what had occurred continued to ripple, touching families, communities, and an entire nation in ways that would not fade easily. The public grappled with a sense of disbelief, a dissonance between the image of suburban tranquility and the horrifying acts that had taken place behind closed doors. It was almost impossible to reconcile, almost impossible to understand, yet the truth had been laid bare, documented, undeniable. The evidence had forced reality into focus, and reality, in this case, was brutal. Paul Bernardo remained incarcerated, sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a man whose crimes had marked him as one of the most notorious figures in Canadian criminal history. The severity of his punishment reflected not only the magnitude of his offenses but also the fear and outrage they had instilled in the public consciousness. Every detail of his acts, every methodical step, and every carefully executed moment of terror had been catalogued, analyzed, and ultimately used to bring him to justice. But while the legal system had acted decisively against him, the consequences for those connected to him, for those caught in the web of his and Karla's actions, were far more enduring and complex. Karla Homolka, released after serving her sentence, became a focal point of societal debate, a living symbol of the ambiguity surrounding culpability, coercion, and complicity. To some, she was a victim, ensnared in a relationship with a man whose capacity for manipulation and violence was overwhelming. To others, she was an active participant, someone whose actions were calculated, deliberate, and morally indefensible. The tapes recovered during the investigation had shown a side of her that could not be ignored, that shattered the initial narrative of passive victimhood. And so, even after the legal consequences of her actions had been served, public judgment remained. People debated the fairness of the plea deal, questioned the ethics of allowing a participant in such heinous crimes to reintegrate into society, and struggled to reconcile the images of the obedient partner and the active accomplice. Her story became a lens through which society examined the limits of legal compromise, the gaps between knowledge and action, and the often uncomfortable reality that justice is imperfect and incomplete. The families of the victims, meanwhile, lived with the weight of their losses in ways that could never be quantified. Grief, in its most unrelenting form, became a daily companion. Each anniversary of disappearance or death reopened old wounds. Each news report or public discussion reminded them of the absence of the girls who would never return, of the birthdays, graduations, and milestones that were stolen before they could even be imagined. Their sorrow was compounded by the knowledge that the events could have been anticipated, prevented, or mitigated, yet had not been. The betrayal of trust, the sense that evil could exist so close to home, so intimately woven into the fabric of ordinary life, left scars deeper than any physical evidence could convey. Communities mourned collectively, but each family grieved uniquely, carrying the memories of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homoka in ways that were intensely personal and impossible to fully share. The societal impact of the case extended far beyond individual grief. Law enforcement procedures were re-examined, protocols for plea deals reconsidered, and investigative methods scrutinized in light of what had been overlooked, misunderstood, or underestimated. The notion that a seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood could conceal a couple capable of such calculated horror forced both police and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, perception, and vigilance. It catalyzed discussions about the treatment of accomplices, the responsibilities of partners in crime, and the ways in which legal and psychological systems intersect to shape outcomes. Educational programs, community safety initiatives, and victim advocacy organizations all drew lessons from the case, using the tragic events to highlight warning signs, teach about manipulative relationships, and underscore the importance of proactive reporting. The story became more than a criminal case, it became a case study in human behavior, manipulation, and the consequences of unchallenged evil. Psychologically, the narrative of Paul and Carla offered stark lessons about the dark intersections of power, control, and dependency. Paul's actions demonstrated the extremes of predatory behavior, the calculated cruelty that could be masked by charm, normalcy, and seeming civility. Carla's involvement illustrated the complex and sometimes horrifying ways in which agency and victimization can coexist, how fear, dependence, and attraction to danger can create circumstances in which moral boundaries are blurred or entirely abandoned. Scholars, criminologists, and psychologists would study the case for decades, seeking to understand the mechanisms of coercion, the triggers for complicity, and the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. It was a story that demanded reflection, not just on criminal behavior, but on the human capacity for both vulnerability and complicity. Even years later, the public fascination and horror endured. Documentaries, books, and podcasts revisited the case repeatedly, dissecting every known detail, reconstructing timelines, and exploring motivations. The story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that evil often hides behind the ordinary, and that the consequences of ignoring warning signs can be devastating. The conversations around the case often turned inward, prompting introspection about personal safety, family dynamics, and the responsibilities of individuals to notice, question, and act when something feels off. Fear, though tempered by time, remained a subtle companion in the collective memory of the communities affected, a silent testament to the events that had unfolded. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Bernardo Homoka saga was not confined to punishment or justice alone. It was a reckoning with the fragility of safety, the complexity of human relationships, and the limits of institutional knowledge. It challenged assumptions about good and evil, victimhood and culpability, and left a permanent mark on the consciousness of a nation. Those who survived the shockwaves of the events, families, friends, neighbors, law enforcement, and the public, carried forward lessons forged in tragedy, vigilance, empathy, and an awareness that darkness can often masquerade as ordinary life. And in that awareness, there was hope, a cautious, persistent hope that by studying, remembering, and understanding, the future might be spared the repetition of horrors that had once seemed inconceivable. After the trials ended and the gavel struck, the echoes of the events did not fade. The streets of Ontario returned to their routine rhythm, children laughed and ran through parks, cars moved along familiar routes, and yet beneath that ordinary surface lingered a tension that could not be dispelled. The community was forever altered, not by visible destruction, but by the invisible scars left in the minds of those who had lived through the fear, the uncertainty, and the revelations. The horrors had been contained in the courtroom, but the psychological aftermath extended far beyond the prison walls, stretching into homes, schools, and neighborhoods, a lingering shadow that reminded everyone that terror often resides where it is least expected. Families who had lost daughters felt a void that would never be filled. Birthdays passed unnoticed, holidays became muted, milestones vanished into the void of what could have been. Grief became a companion, unrelenting and private, while public outrage burned in collective memory. The knowledge that these atrocities had been carried out so close to home, in spaces that had once felt safe, left a lasting unease, a realization that evil can wear the most familiar of faces. Paul Bernardo remained behind bars, serving life sentences without the possibility of parole, a man whose calculated cruelty had left an indelible mark on Canadian society. His crimes were catalogued with precision, every detail scrutinized, every step analyzed to understand the methods behind the madness. His presence, now confined to a cell, contrasted sharply with the life he had led, a life that had appeared ordinary, suburban, even mundane, yet contained within it a darkness that had wreaked irreversible damage. His punishment represented the culmination of years of investigative work, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the desperate hope that accountability could at least partially assuage the collective trauma. Yet punishment alone could not restore the stolen innocence, could not fill the void left in the lives of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homoka. Karla Homoka's release and reintegration into society provoked enduring debate. To some, she remained a victim, manipulated by a man whose control had been both psychological and physical. To others, she was an accomplice, someone who had participated actively in atrocities that defied comprehension. The tapes that emerged after her plea deal painted a starkly different picture than initially presented, revealing moments of agency and complicity that shattered the notion of complete victimhood. Her existence in the public sphere became a source of moral questioning, a reminder of the limitations and compromises inherent in the justice system. The controversy surrounding her case forced society to wrestle with difficult questions about responsibility, coercion, and the fine line between fear and choice. Her story highlighted the complexities of human behavior and the uncomfortable realities of negotiating justice when complete truth remains partially obscured. The ripple effects of the case were felt in families, law enforcement, and broader society. Families of the victims continued to navigate grief that was as much social as it was personal. Each memory, each anniversary, each reference to the girl stirred pain that could not be diminished by time. Communities collectively mourned, but individual sorrow persisted, unique and isolating. Law enforcement agencies were forced to examine protocols, refine investigative procedures, and rethink how relationships and partnerships could influence criminal behavior. The limitations of a single offender model became evident, prompting a re-evaluation of how to approach cases where complicity and manipulation intersect. Legal processes, particularly the use of plea bargains, were scrutinized, sparking discussions about timing, knowledge, and fairness. The decisions made in the early stages of the case, before all evidence was fully understood, revealed how gaps in information could profoundly impact outcomes, leaving lasting questions about justice and accountability. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case extensively, seeking to understand the mechanics of manipulation, control, and co-offending. Paul Bernardo's capacity for calculated cruelty offered insight into predatory behavior, while Karla Homoka's dual role as victim and accomplice provided a rare and unsettling glimpse into the dynamics of coercion and agency. The case became a reference point in understanding the ways human behavior can be warped by obsession, dependence, and shared deviance. Beyond criminal analysis, it sparked broader societal reflection about vigilance, trust, and the recognition of warning signs within relationships and communities. The story became a lens for examining how normalcy can mask danger, how the mundane can conceal the monstrous, and how understanding human psychology is essential to preventing tragedy. Even decades later, public fascination with the case endured. Documentaries, books, podcasts, and media coverage continue to dissect every element, reconstructing events and analyzing decisions. The story was retold not merely to shock, but to educate, to warn, and to grapple with the uncomfortable truths it revealed. It became a case study in vigilance, in the fragility of trust, and in the consequences of ignoring subtle signs of danger. Fear lingered in the collective consciousness, a reminder that the horrors of the past were not distant, but intimately connected to the places and people around them. Communities, while outwardly functioning, retained a heightened awareness of what could happen when darkness hides behind ordinary facades. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Bernardo Homolka saga was not just about legal resolution. It was a reckoning with morality, with human complexity, and with the fragility of societal structures that aim to protect yet are sometimes blindsided. It challenged assumptions about victimhood, complicity, and evil, leaving a permanent imprint on public consciousness. Lessons were absorbed painfully, through grief, debate, and reflection, yet they offered a measure of hope, that through awareness, education, and vigilance, the repetition of such horrors could be mitigated. The events became both a memorial to those lost and a warning to those who live, a reminder that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary darkness, and that understanding, reflection, and action are the tools by which society